So it's my pleasure this morning to introduce Wade Burgess, who is the executive pastor of Grand Parkway Baptist Church, who actually spent 20 years in the healthcare industry, 16 years at United Surgical Partners, where he was partly in charge of development and also a regional vice president. One of the reasons why I wanted him to come and speak in chapel is because many of our students here, which means y'all, had very successful pre-seminary careers, either as a stay-at-home parent or that you were in another vocation that had nothing to do with, in particular, with ministry, and now you're shifting to vocational ministry, and that is Wade. And so I want to hear from him because he has a little bit of experience in that area. So please give a warm DTS welcome to Pastor Wade Burgess.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that. What I'm viewing our time together today is really kind of like a halftime speech, if you'll let me do that. I want to encourage, I want to kind of shake awake a little bit. But unlike a halftime speech, I also have a little bit of a portion where I might want to convict you related to, I might want to show you the exit. We'll talk about that in just a second. That'll make more sense. But my goal for our time together really is just whatever God is wanting you to do related to what He's calling you to. And we're going to get to the definition of calling in a moment as well. But whatever it is that we can do God's will, that's what I want us to do. And you're probably thinking, yeah, no duh, that's what we do every day, right, at DTS. But I just want us to talk about what does that look like as it relates to what is not needed, what is needed, both in ministry, and then what does that small voice sound like to some of us? Now, you are not getting an eloquent preacher today, so we'll refund your money if we need to for whatever you paid to come to chapel. But what you are getting is someone that has said yes to that still small voice. And so my experience as an executive pastor of only about 4 years probably does not give me the weight, the impetus, maybe even the privilege to talk to you today about some of the things I'm going to say. But let me say this. I've been a Christian a long time, and therefore I've been in ministry a long time. I also have a long track record of being a good churchman, something we need more of. And so today I'm going to talk to you from that long track record of being a good churchman related to what we don't need and what we need in ministry, and then that listening for the call. So, what is it that we don't need in ministry? What are the things that I have seen out there, both just going to church, being in church for a long time, but also being on staff at a church? What is it that we don't need? The first thing we don't need is lazy. Now, my definition of lazy is an unwillingness to do any necessary task. It's really a mindset. Lazy is a mindset. It's an unwillingness to do, whether that is we're taking out trash or we're cleaning toilets. If you have an unwillingness to do whatever it takes in ministry, please don't be in ministry. So we don't need lazy. We need to lead by example instead. The second thing we do not need in ministry is passive. Now, we don't need to be passive toward sin, passive toward culture, and we especially don't need anyone in ministry who is passive about their own personal sin. So let me say, friends, if there is an issue that you're dealing with, whether it's, porn or temper, whether it's alcohol or food, I want to encourage, I want to implore you to get help with that. And just a sidebar for only a second, because we're friends already here, let me just say this about food. One of the things that I don't think we talk about very often is obesity and gluttony as it relates to the ministry. If you've got a porn addiction, man, we're going to meet on Mondays and on Tuesdays. We're going to have a prayer group, and on Wednesdays, we're going to have the kids come around you and pray. Well, maybe we won't do that. But we're going to do all kind of things, right, to help you. And boy, if you came in and said, hey, I'm struggling in my marriage. I'm not the kind of husband I need to be. Boy, we're going to get around and help. We rarely talk about that issue of, what about food? And just because someone looks like they have a problem with food doesn't necessarily mean they do. And just because someone looks like they don't doesn't mean they don't. Food, as much as anything, I think, demonstrates our discipline and it demonstrates our faith. And so let's be sure we're not passive related to anything that might disqualify us from ministry. The third thing I definitely know we do not need in ministry is a lack of work ethic. Now that on the surface may sound like, well, didn't you already say lazy? And so what's the difference between lazy and lack of work ethic? Lazy is an unwillingness to do. A lack of work ethic in my mind really is, it just says, I don't have a desire to do it. I have an unwillingness versus a desire. Now, hear me in this. A lack of work ethic is not a lack of know-how. There is a lot of us that don't know how, but we certainly have the desire and the willingness to do it. And let me just give you a hint. If you're going to be pastoring in a church, then one of the, I think probably humbling and most ingratiating things you can do to a hardworking man or woman in your congregation is to say, hey, I don't know how to do that. Could you teach me? I promise you they are going to come alongside of you and teach you. I've seen it personally firsthand. Now, if you demonstrate a willingness to work, they are going to help you in every way possible. And I promise you that kind of admission, that admission of, hey, I'm not exactly sure how to work, or I don't know how to do this, that's going to do more for your reputation than it would be if you bought everybody lunch every other Sunday, okay? And so that idea of a lack of work ethic, and in fact, I'm a staunch supporter that anyone that's going into ministry, anyone that's going to go work for a church, please go out and get a secular job for 3 years before you come to work at the church. Okay? And we don't have to talk about that unless we want to offline, but too many in the ministry don't know how to work and they're not sure what that definition is. So, lazy and unwillingness, lack of work ethic is a lack of desire. So what do we need? If those are some things that we don't need lazy, we don't need passivity, we don't need a lack of work ethic, then what would we need in ministry? The first thing I would tell you is a willingness. Absolutely, we have to have a willingness in ministry. One of my least favorite words is no, and one of my favorite words is yes. And it's not because as the executive pastor, I get to dole out responsibilities and tasks and I want everybody to go, yep, I'll do it just for the sake of doing it. No, there's I think a spirit of willingness as much as anything. You have to be willing to get your hands dirty figuratively in ministry. What that might look like is you come alongside a family that's lost a child, one of the most deeply tragic things they can go through. And you got to get your hands dirty in that. And it's not just right after the event, and it's not just before the funeral or right after. It's weeks after, months after. In fact, I would want to encourage you, it's every year of that anniversary of that tragedy. Now, some of you are thinking, well, I mean, it's been 3 years. Do I really, should I call them and remind them? Maybe you don't think they're remembering that all the time? Then you're not a parent. And so that willingness to get dirty figuratively is going to be necessary in ministry. You will need to come alongside your people in their messes, and you're going to have to help them. The second aspect of that willingness, I think, related to getting our hands dirty is, I believe it's also literally. It's practically. Sometimes, by the way, it might be mowing a widow's yard on a regular basis. Sometimes it might be, I don't know, shoulder to shoulder with your housekeeper cleaning the toilets. You have to be willing. And I don't want you to hear me say this, oh, so you're telling us to do it all. That's really what you're saying. No, not at all. People, we have got to be in the business of equipping the saints for ministry. The Word tells us that. And we need to give our people the dignity of service. But you need to come alongside of them. You need to have that willingness to do so. And I promise you, your flock is going to pick up on that. The people that you minister to are going to notice that. Whether that is in a women's shelter or that's in a 3,000 member church, they are going to recognize your willingness. And we need that in ministry. The other thing I believe that we need in ministry is tithers. If you're not tithing at your church where you're going right now, I would strongly encourage you to do so. Not just because it is obedience, but because it is obedience. And by the way, if you don't want to tithe and you don't want to do that, quit. Don't go to that church. We don't need thieves and we don't need hypocrisy in ministry. And so Let me give it to you like this. So we had a person on our staff not long ago, and they came on and they were working with us, and somewhere in a meeting, this person said, I don't think I'd tithe if it wasn't in my job description. And kind of like the DJ hitting the needle on the record, I kind of went, say what? He said, yeah, if it wasn't in my job description, I don't think I'd tithe. I don't know if I believe in that. Now, listen to the depth of hypocrisy this is. Here is a person that is getting paid, including benefits, that is doing ministry all because of people's tithes and offerings. And he says, yeah, I don't think I want to do that. Let me tell you how that's ended for him. He ain't with us no more. And it's not because of some failure for us to grasp onto a New Age, New Testament theology that says, well, Jesus didn't talk about tithe. I mean, He said He's free from all the law. I mean, why in the world we've got to do that? No, that is not accurate. We don't have time today for us to unpack that theologically, but we absolutely have to be tithers. What else we need in ministry is dedication. Now, I don't want you to hear or get mixed up that dedication is sacrificing self and family on the altar of service. Don't think that, okay? What dedication is I think Eugene Peterson, the author, put it very well. It is a long obedience in the same direction. I'm dedicated to something. I'm going to lock in with you, and here we go. And I'm going to stay with you as long as we need to. If you're wondering what dedication looks like, here's what I would encourage you to do. One day, take a little field trip, drive south on 59 till you get to Pleak or East Bernard. Anybody know where I'm talking about? Have you been out that way? Sit down with a pastor there that's pastoring about 30 people every Sunday and mention to him or her the word of dedication and get a definition from them. And by the way, in that, just talking about 30, I just wonder, is 30 enough for you? If some of you are thinking, hey, you know what I get to do as a pastor or a minister in a particular area? I get 2 study days, and then I get to meet with my affirmation team, and oh boy, they're going to buff me up with that affirmation cream, and then on Sundays I get to bring the thunder. You ought to ask yourself, is 30 enough? You'd better have a vision of preaching, and that's speaking and living the gospel, no matter how many are in front of you. Whether it's 28 people at the HEB or it's 300 people on a Sunday children's ministry, wherever it is, you'd better be comfortable with whatever God puts you in and in front of. And a lot of times that's going to be outside of the church. We also have a willingness, now stay with me on this one, we have a willingness to be bit. What do I mean by that? So I'm originally from Louisiana. I'm a big fan of the LSU Tigers, and keep your opinions to yourself. But yeah, there you go. Go Tigers. And so there's this story that Coach Ogeron, when he was first hired, there is no more fitting in my mind a coach than Coach Ogeron for LSU. Okay, but that's another story for another time. And so Coach Ogeron comes into this big meeting room with all his players very first day, kind of right out of the box. And he walks in, and all the players are kind of quiet. They're not sure what to expect. They've heard some things. And he's got a 5-gallon bucket, and he brings it with him, and he sets it on stage. And Coach Ogeron, man, he's looking in the eye of every one of them, and he's saying, we need dedication, and we need heart, and there's no I in team. And he's just getting after them, right? About the kind of new culture that's going to be established at LSU. He then reaches into this bucket, and he pulls out a baby alligator. Now, these baby alligators have like razor-sharp teeth. Okay? Coach O drops his pants, puts that alligator on his behind, and the alligator bites him right on the behind. He lets the alligator go, and that thing is hanging off of him. Blood is dripping down the back of his leg. And he's walking around the stage with this alligator on him, and he says, men, how many of you are going to be willing to get through the tough things? How many of you are going to be willing to bleed for your team? How many of you are going to be willing to go through the fight? And he takes his finger and pokes the alligator in the eye. The alligator lets go, and he drops it back in the bucket. And he says, now, how many of you are going to be tough like that? There was an offensive lineman sitting on the front row. His name was Chad Robichaud, and he raises his hand and he says, hey, Coach, I'll bite you on the behind if you don't poke me in the eye to make me let go. I don't know if that story's true or not, but Here's my point in telling you that. In ministry, you have to be willing to be bitten for principle. Now, don't hear me say policy. In fact, you should probably write this down. It's people over policy most of the time. Okay, and that comes from an executive pastor that loves policy. But principle is different. What that looks like at the church that I attend is that we became elder-led in about 2016. Over the course of the last few years, we have had to dismiss 3 different elders because they weren't living according to biblical principles that an elder should live like. And we've said, hey, you can't serve in that capacity anymore. Now, those elders are still loved by us in the church. Those elders had a fan club, if you know what I mean. Those elders were popular, etc. But when we make a decision on principle, we have to be willing to be bit sometimes, unpopular, and all of those things, because we're going to stick to our principles. And so that's what I mean by a willingness to be bit. We are going sometimes to have to look a mother in the eye and say, I'm sorry, but your child can't go to us on an overnight student trip because of fill in the blank. And it's going to be unpopular. And it's going to be kind of countercultural. And we've got to be willing to say, no, I'm willing to bleed a little bit so that we don't have problems later, because I got a whole flock to protect versus just one. So you're probably thinking, now look, we come to chapel and typically the people that are in front of us, I think they use the Bible, and you've been up there a while and you haven't used the Bible. So let me get to that. This idea of this still small voice, this idea of answering the call. And I want to synchronize ourselves around these 2 definitions, if you will, of calling. First, I want to use Os Guinness, a great author. He said this about calling. Calling is not only a matter of being and doing what we are, being and doing just what we are, but also of becoming what we are not yet, but called by God to be. That, I think, is a great definition of this calling into ministry. Now, the definition I use for call is that it is more than a casual suggestion that requires action on the part of the hearer. More than just a casual suggestion. That's what my pastor was making to me for about 5 or 6 years when he was inviting me to join the church as executive pastor. It was kind of or at least I thought, a casual suggestion. And then one time he made it, and it changed from a casual suggestion to something that had weight, kind of had some unction on it. And God was doing something in me. That is my definition of call. Now look, I think for each one of us, it looks a little bit different. But it is tailored. It is specific to each one of us. For me, it was just a whisper that had compression. Where do I get that? Let me reference 1 Kings chapter 19. Now, if you know this story, you know that Elijah has just put on this great display of being synced up with God. You remember he set fire to the Baal prophets and burned up their altars and all this stuff, right? And right after this great display then, they're after him. And Elijah runs for about 3 days into the wilderness to get away. And he's headed to kind of the Mount of God, and God rescues him there, and God says this to him, and they have this little exchange. This is what 1 Kings 19, just 3 verses, 10 through 12, tell us. He replied, I've been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty. The Israelites have rejected your covenant, torn down your altars, and put your prophets to death with the sword. I'm the only one left, and now they're trying to kill me too. And this was God's response. The Lord said, go out and stand on the mountain in the presence of the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by. Then a great and powerful wind tore the mountains apart, shattered the rocks before the Lord, but the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind, there was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake came a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire came a gentle whisper. What we need in ministry is those that have heard the voice. Whether it's a loud calling, and it can be, or just a quiet, gentle voice with compression that's saying, I'm inviting you into something more than you could ask or imagine. What we don't need is someone who thinks, I'll go into the ministry as my last resort. I've tried all these other jobs. I think I'll do that. What we don't need is somebody that says, you know what, this has been a family lineage, and so therefore my dad, my granddad, I need to do that as well. We don't need that. We don't need it if this is just another job to you. What we need is those that have heard the voice and said yes. Let me pray for you. We'll be done. God, thank you so much that you have allowed us to experience the power of calling. God, the great thing about you is that you don't need a single one of us to get your will done. And yet you said, you know what, I'm going to give you the privilege of being involved in this story that I've been telling for a long, long time. It's a story of grace and redemption, of forgiveness, of restoration. And God, here's the other thing about you, is that if we say, nah, I don't think so, you don't say, oh, please, would you? Instead, you say, okay, I'll find somebody else. The Bible's full of those that missed out. God, I pray that these men and women here today do not miss out on the calling that you have for them. And Lord, I pray for the conviction and the encouragement that if the calling is not specifically in a paid ministry position, they'd recognize that. Because God, as Christians, we're not necessarily in the ministry, but we're in ministry. And so, Lord, I pray that you would give them a boldness to recognize that if I'm called to ministry, maybe it's I still work at that Amazon warehouse, or I still am an executive at my firm. God, I pray that you would bar the gates of ministry from what we don't need. And I pray, God, that you would equip the people you are calling for exactly what we do need. Do in and through us, all for the benefit of your kingdom, all for the spreading of your gospel. It's in your name, Jesus, that we ask these things. Amen.